All right, welcome back to another episode with Rabbi Moshe Schulman, Debunking Missionary Claims, Part 4, the Bible in the First and Early Second Century. Sit tight, we will be right back. Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA. I say that like it's some massive place, little tiny hodunk town, but broadcasting to you with some wonderful, wonderful Rabbanim. So welcome back to the show. Welcome back, Rabbi. It's always a pleasure having you here, and it's good to have our show back up and running. This episode is showing to be more and more popular by topic. And it seems like we're getting into more popular topics as we go along. So more exciting topics.
This show is going to be a little bit controversial.
I'm count on it.
With a back echo from you.
All right. Try it now.
Let's see. Yeah, now seems okay.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'm counting on it. That's what we're hoping for.
Yeah. Okay. This one is a lot of the stuff. Remember, I haven't even gotten actually seriously into Dr. Brown's book, and the reason is because there's so many things that I take for granted, and when I'm going to be discussing about his book that people need to know, that it just takes me a little while to get through some of the stuff. Okay, so this is Debunking the Missionaries, number 12 in our series. The present topic we're doing is the New Testament, don't bet your soul on it. This is the fourth one in this present topic, and what we're dealing with now is we're discussing about the New Testament in the actual first and early second centuries, the very beginning from the time when Jesus died until then. This is the second one on that. And we're going to continue in this one on some of what we did last week. And we're going to bring it this week to the New Testament itself. Now, if you remember what we did last week, we discussed the ideas involving oral traditions, which, as everyone recognizes, all the books of the Gospels, and I guess even you could say Paul, the information he gets that he uses in his letters, all of these are based on oral traditions. The important thing to recognize is that in order for someone to say that the theology or the stories, anything in the New Testament is true, we have to have faith, confidence that these oral traditions are actually correct. So while a lot of our discussion about the New Testament, and we will of course get into that also, discusses the various texts that we have now, what's the real text, what's the original text, what we're dealing with now is before the original text actually came into existence. Our next class is actually going to do it, the next time we do it, which is when I come back from Israel, we're going to actually start dealing with the composition of the material that actually ends up being in the New Testament, the Gospel specifically. So what I brought into here and last week, and we discussed, is the concept of what happens when there's failed prophecies. And I just want to go over that very shortly because we're going to see how you can apply this to the New Testament. Now, this is something that's pretty well known in the psychological literature, but you don't really find it in any of the apologetic literature. I've done a lot of readings by Christians in things dealing with, for example, the resurrection is the biggest historical type of thing that's discussed, besides the issue of whether Jesus existed himself. The resurrection being something based on the New Testament itself, where the historicity deals a lot with outside works, and we're going to get to that too, please, hopefully. Now, so even when we deal with people who do not agree, like Bart Ehrman and those who follow that, you don't really see this discussion coming up. So that's why it's very important, because it's fundamental to understanding whether we consider the New Testament itself reliable, even from the original writing that got put together, whether we consider what came into that valid, is only based on certain assumptions that are given that are not really examined very often. For example, a number of the assumptions are that the oral traditions are passed down exactly as they occurred, these people faithfully said things from one generation to another. Okay, so last week I pointed out the fact that I come from a Hasidic culture, which is probably obvious to any of you who see what my picture looks like. I definitely do not look like what most of you are seeing walking around in the streets in your city. I'm sure, William, you don't see people look like me in your city very often, if at all.
No.
Okay, but in Hasidic communities, that's the way people look. Okay, now by us, stories are extremely important, and we recognize, in fact, that the difference between taking story as being totally historical, actually events, as being those things that are not, are just meant to teach certain lessons. I gave the example from a work called Shivchei HaBaal Shem Tov, which is translates praises of Baal Shem Tov, which is one of the earliest examples of books with stories about the Baal Shem Tov. In it has a very long introduction, which you will find that most people don't accept those stories as being 100% true, as opposed to the rest of it, where the author brings from a manuscript from his father-in-law, where he traces back, he heard this story from this person, which people do consider to be true. So just making a point that being an oral culture does not tell us that things are actually true. Stories are not told the same when they're done over again. And this is pretty much agreed upon. I mentioned Michael Licona, who talks about these issues, and we'll bring this up again when we talk more about the historicity. Okay, then what I said is like this, and this is extremely important. If we're going to deal with issues in the New Testament, and we're going to try and point out why we do not believe that those incidents really occurred, we find a lot of times the apologists of Christianity say, well, you have to give us a valid counter theory that explains it in a way that's not like ad hoc, meaning that you just don't, bring it up just to say it. So in this case, I want to bring something which is very well known, but it's something that we don't see actually engaged with in any of the apologetic literature. I don't see it in William Wayne Craig. I don't see it in Licona. I don't see it in Habermas. I don't even see it in people like Ehrman, who is in his discussion of did Jesus exist, in one of his more recent books. You would expect to find it in something like that, but I didn't see that there. So I think it's very important to bring it up because it is something that applies specifically to here. And again, that was the issue of what happens when prophecies fail. Now, what happens is I went to a book, and I just want to go this so you're clear, because I want to go into the New Testament, and I'm going to show you actually that you can see there the actual idea of how failed prophecy actually, this concept, the syndrome of failed prophecy applies there. Now, again, we mentioned in this book on when prophecy fails, there are certain conditions that we look for in a group, which is, number one, there must be a strong conviction. And our example was, of course, we took two examples. One is the followers of Shab Tzvi who held with him after he converted to Islam. We're not talking about those that would abandon him, which were the overwhelming majority. We're talking about those who still stayed with him. So, and the other example was of a group that exists in Lubavitch today who, outside of the mainstream, actually don't believe that Lubavitch ever died, that in fact his grave site, which Lubavitchers and non-Lubavitchers going to visit, to pray over in Queens, New York, is actually empty. Okay, we're talking about those people specifically. Okay, and here's what we have. So first of all, there must be a conviction, and there must be a commitment to this conviction. So in both cases, it was a case. These were committed to Shab Tzvi as being the Messiah, and these people were convicted to Lubavitch as ever being the Messiah. The conviction must be amenable to unequivocal confirmation. Okay, in both cases, we know, of course, with Shab Tzvi, of course, we know that the Mashiach is supposed to be king of Israel, and he's supposed to be a righteous person. I mean, we all know Isaiah 11, talking about the great righteousness and God-fearingness of the Messiah. So that's pretty clear. And of course, dying is not within the purview. As I pointed out, that one of the Lubavitchers, the Lubavitcher was alive, actually wrote something specifically stating that, of course, the Mashiach dying is, of course, disqualifying. Such unequivocal disconfirmation must occur. That means that when we saw with Shab Tzvi, we see that Shab Tzvi actually converted to Islam totally disconfirming that he could have been Mashiach because he did an act which shows obviously his wickedness. Likewise, Lubavitcher Rebbe, 20-something years ago, died and was buried in Queens, as viewed by many, many people and is believed by the overwhelming majority of people in Lubavitch. We're talking about a small group in there that you do find actually on the internet. I found them on Facebook, but yeah. Social support must be available subsequent to the discomfiture, disconfirmation. And this also we find. There were people who followed Shopsy Tzvi when he was in prison. He had his group there, and he had his prophet, Nilsson from Gaza, who kept them together. And likewise, this group within the Lubavitch who will never go to they call it never caver. They never go to the gravesite because they believe the Lubavitch Rebbe is still alive. They have their own group that keeps themselves together. So we see there all these kinds of things actually happen in real life in a Jewish context. As I saw, there was another book called Expecting Armageddon, which discusses it from the sense of the Jehovah's Witnesses and others, so that it's not just it's pretty much universal. My bringing those two groups was because I wanted to point out that it's something that actually you could see in a Jewish context surrounding somebody who is believed by at least his followers to be possibly the Messiah. Okay? Let me drink some. I have a very bad. I'm getting over cold, so my voice might go. So I made some tea for myself. I might make some tea later on again if I need it.
No problem.
Cinnamon tea.
Hey, sounds good to me.
It smells good also. So let's go into the New Testament. Now again, how are we going to know if the New Testament itself indicates that? Now, we're going to be discussing about the New Testament in depth. So I'm not going to, I don't want to get sidetracked and go too much into it right now. So I chose out one instance. And when we get to Dr. Brown's discussion of New Testament objections, we're going to bring up more about it. So I'm basically introducing this concept here now, showing you how a real careful reading of the New Testament, things that people just know but they didn't think about, sees it. In fact, this happened. Jesus was alive. He had certain teachings alive. He dies, and afterwards, his followers, after he dies, changes what his teachings were like, and all kinds of new things came up. One of them I will argue later is the resurrection. We'll see why. But before I can get to that, I want to show you something that is extremely important. I consider extremely significant, and yet is something that's somewhat taken for granted as being something more of the line of being evolutional rather than being a total break.
So I was able to get the software on screen. So we pushed through that final struggle there. So I'll be able to follow you along. Okay.
Okay. Good. Then we're going to go into the New Testament.
Very good.
And we're going to start with one concept, see how it is when Jesus was alive, then go into the book of Acts as an example of it, see how that changes after Jesus dies. And then I'm going to go back to you and show you why this is a problem. Okay? Why this shows, in fact, that what we're dealing with here is actually an instance of failed prophecy syndrome, where in fact, when the Jesus dies, they have to reinterpret the meaning of his life in order to be able to continue as a group.
Got it. Not a problem.
Okay, so this will be a simple one. It'll just make it easier when we talk about the historials of Jesus, when we talk about the resurrection then, as to whether the resurrection is a historical event or not. Also the birth stories in the New Testament, we're going to talk about those, whether that's historical or not. I want to show you that there's actually grounds to believe, in fact, that these things were actually made up post-crucifixion of Jesus. And I'm saying post-crucifixion of Jesus because I haven't discussed about whether we can consider the crucifixion itself historical or not, and to why we would consider it not. So I'll just leave that on the side for the moment, not to overburden you with too much different subjects. Okay, so let's look at the first one. First one I want to look at is Matthew 10, verse 5 and 6.
All right, Matthew 10, 5 and 6. There you go.
Okay. Now, this is after it says the 10 names of the 12 names of disciples in verse 2 through 4. Verse 5, and again, I'm reading from, this is the RSV version, I believe, is what they use as the basis. I'm using my Jewish annotated New Testament. So let's continue. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. So now this is important. This is clearly, if you have your red letter of the Bible, this is going to be read because this is what Jesus is himself actually saying. From the horse's mouth, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans. Samaritans were a group that claimed to be Jewish, but according to Jewish law, we don't consider them. They were supposed some kinds of converts, but the conversions were not considered valid for various reasons. Not interesting. Now we might bring it up later if someone wants to talk about rabbinic Judaism. Okay, so enter no town of Samaritans. So go not to the Gentiles and not to the Samaritans. That leaves out only one group of people. But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Go to the house of Israel. As you go proclaim the good news, the kingdom of heaven is come near. Okay? Jesus' message is quite clear. Jesus has come for the lost sheep of Israel to speak to the Jewish people in Judea and Galilee. That's where he lived. He did not go outside of areas where there was Jewish people lived. And we see here clearly, when he's sending his disciples to start going, he's telling them not to go into the non-Jewish cities that existed in the area of Judea and the environments around Galilee. Okay, now there's another one, which is very important. Let's go to Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28. This is a very, very, very famous. Okay? And it says here again, this would be a very important story here. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Tyre and Sidon were at one time part of the northern kingdom. So it's still considered part of Judea. Sometimes it's considered part of Phoenicia. Excuse me if I cough a little bit. I still am not totally healed up for being sick this week. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." Okay, so here we see an interaction with a non-Jewish person. Okay, so now in the Gemara we talk about something called the Masarav, when we see an action by somebody showing exactly what their actions, what they believe, what their teachings are. So they might teach something, but maybe they're more strict with themselves about something. So the question is, okay, Jesus told them, well, here's something happened. What's he saying to do? But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." Okay. Now again, what does Jesus say? Remember what we said earlier. Jesus said to his disciples and him, he's only for the lost sheep of Israel. So it continues. He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." Again, she keeps asking him. He answered, "It is not fair to take children's food and throw it to the dogs." So, among other things, he's using shows a not very high opinion of non-Jewish people in his analogy here. So she said, she wasn't so stupid, she was quite smart in this answer. "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." So what's she saying? Is it's true you have nothing to do with me, but listen, if I'm around here, I'm listening to you. I should get, crumbs, something from you. I came to you, I'm listening to you. So even though you're not intending me, there's no reason why I shouldn't get.
Right.
She said, well, then Jesus answered, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done to you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So what do we see here? Quite clearly that Jesus was saying, listen, my purpose is only the Jewish people. When she showed an attachment and apparently an agreement with his message and treated him and showed some kind of sincerity, he said, okay, fine. But that's not what I'm intending on doing. There's no push to go to the non-Jews. There's nothing to do with that. Okay? Now, let's pause a second. Jesus died. Okay? Jesus died.
Right.
All right? That's a fact that we all agree that if he lived, he died.
Right.
Now, let's look. The book of Acts, as I mentioned before when discussing about the New Testament, the book of Acts extends the history of the Christians, the Christian groups, from the time Jesus died, going on afterwards. Okay? So it's very important. Jesus has now died. Okay? So what happens to his followers? How are they acting? Well, if you look clearly, in chapter 2, if we look throughout chapter 2, we find out, say, for example, chapter 5, he talks about the devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. So Jews coming to Jerusalem from all over the world. That's very common, by the way. Josephus talks about it, especially around Passover. It was very common for Jews to come from all over. Philo mentions that he went and visited Jerusalem once. Philo lived in Alexandria in Egypt, but it was very common for Jews to have a strong desire to go to Israel and to visit there, at least to visit, to see the temple, to bring a sacrifice if they could, to see what goes on there. It was a very big thing. So what he's referring to here is something that's a pretty well-known fact. And so he speaks to the crowd. And he talks in tongues, and you find out that Jews from all kinds of different places understood. You mentioned some of the cities that we heard. Okay. Now, if you continue to look through again, you will find, for example, verse 29, it says, fellow Israelites, I must say to you, commonly ever answered David, that he who was buried, his tomb is with us to this day. Fine. Okay? Again and again, we see again and again, who is Peter going to? Peter is going to Jews only. We see that again in chapter 3. We see constantly that the message was being sent to the Jewish people exclusively. Now, there were non-Jews in Jerusalem. There were Romans that were there. Obviously, in the towns around Jerusalem, there were places where non-Jews lived also. But we see here exclusively in the beginning, in the book of Acts, it's quite clear that the followers of Jesus, the original followers of Jesus who lived in Jerusalem at the very beginning, they only went to Jewish people. And that really agrees quite clearly with what Matthew says in chapter 10 and chapter 15. His purpose is to go to the Jewish people alone, and that's what he tells his followers to do. Go visit the Jewish people. Okay, so now let's continue. That's what's happening. But all of a sudden, in chapter 10, something happens. Until chapter 10, Peter, all the other disciples, from the original disciples, only had to do with Jews. Chapter 10, we find this instance of Cornelius, who was a centurion, meaning that he was a Roman in a Roman legion. I believe the centurion was actually a leader of centurion. You'd think is a leader of 100, but it was really there only. His cohort actually had, like, I think 60 was the actual number. That's what the cohorts were. But he was a officer, was an important person. Okay, so we see a story about that. But then what happens in Acts 10, 9 through 23? What do we see? Peter has a dream. And in the dream, he sees heaven open, and he's shown all kinds of creatures that are clearly not kosher. Now remember another important thing. All the followers here of Jesus kept the kosher laws. They all followed the Torah. The only thing that really appears to have distinguished them between themselves and any of the Pharisees around who they were, as I pointed out from Josephus, Judaism in the first century was basically Pharisaic Judaism. That was really the excuse me, that was the orthodoxy. So there was really nothing that distinguished them from the other Pharisees there. So he ate kosher. So he sees in a dream and says, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." Meaning she just slaughtered these things. So he answers, this is 14, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean."
And this is like 10 years after Jesus supposedly died, right?
This is a while.
It's a long time.
Not the time it is not really as important for the point I'm trying to make here. It could have been 3 or 4 weeks. It doesn't make a difference. One of the points I forgot...
it would make a big difference to people coming out of Christianity, because it's very possible if it was only 3 or 4 weeks, then maybe they didn't get the memo. But we're talking like 10 years. If something was going to change, they would have known by then for sure.
Yeah, okay. I understand the point you're making. I was looking from a different aspect, in that a lot of times it's claimed that changes take a long time to occur.
Right.
Whereas, in fact, both with Shabtai Tzvi, when he converted to Islam, and that group of people that I'm talking about, Lubavitch, who believed that Lubavitch was buried, that was immediate.
Right, gotcha.
Those they spun on a dime, as they say.
Right.
Okay? We're not talking about something that took, months for them to do. There was a certain amount of shock, what happened, but they immediately got over it and did it. And in fact, that's what happened when prophecy fails. It was immediate.
Right.
We're talking about a short amount of time.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is that, we're talking about something that happened. If you say it's 10 years, that's fine. I didn't look at the exact time. It wasn't as important to it. It could have been months, but it doesn't make a difference. Okay? But you see here that he was so it's happened to him 3 times, and he was puzzled. So then what happens is, from that he learns that he's allowed to have an interaction with Cornelius and to, follow with him and go with him and somehow accept him in some way. So Acts 10, which, if you're saying, is 10 years afterwards, which of course is a considerable time after Jesus died, it is after Jesus died, is the first instance we see where any of those people who actually knew Jesus personally and spoke with him, had been told about it, actually went to non-Jews.
Mm-hmm, right.
Interesting. Okay? Now, he had a vision from heaven. We could talk about Deuteronomy 13 in context to that, how you could have a vision change something that you were told to do specifically. That's a different story. It's another issue that comes up. But I want to leave that on the side for the moment, just so we get a little chronology going on here. Jesus, when he was alive, only go to the non-Jews. Mm-hmm. Go to the Jews, excuse me. Jesus dies at the beginning of Acts, they only go to the Jews. They understood Jesus' message, only supposed to go to the Jews. First time we see the change, Acts 10, because Peter changed because he has a vision of some sort. Whether that's a valid reason to change what you're doing, following the Torah, whatever, that's obviously not the case, but that's not really the issue that's involved here. I'm trying to get a chronology because I want to show how we see that actually the New Testament text is showing us that actually this is coming up from later on. Now, we go to Acts 13. Acts 13 is talking about Paul. If we talk about Paul, 46 and 47. That's it. 13, 46, 47. Now, this tells us how Paul started going to the non-Jews. Remember, Jesus said, go to the Jews only. Okay? So here's what Paul says. Next Sabbath, the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and blaspheming, and they contradicted what was spoken by Paul. Okay, so they're disagreeing with Paul, which is fine. We understand that. That's the whole purpose of Acts, is tell us that the Jews didn't like it, what was going on. But important, listen to this. Then both Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, saying, it was necessary that the word of God should be spoken first to you. Since you rejected and judged yourselves to be unworthy of eternal life, we are now turning to the Gentiles. One second, hold on, what's going on here? Jesus said, go only there. In the beginning, they got over. Peter had a vision. So we see Peter's going to be more accepting of this. But Jesus said one thing, and all of a sudden, and what's Paul's reason for doing it? Paul didn't have a revelation from God. Paul said, okay, you Jews don't like me. I want to get my crowds. I want to get my people. Let me go to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Right.
See what's happening here.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't gotten to my point of failed prophecy yet. Okay? Because remember, the view from the New Testament itself is, well, this is fine. God really wanted him to do that. Peter is actually telling us it was actually God's will. Paul might not have heard, but it was still God's will to do that. Okay? That all of a sudden, somehow, Jesus died and God's will's changed. Okay? Then we come to Acts 15. Starting verse 6, really. Acts 15 is very, very, very critical. Now, unfortunately, if you're not Jewish, you're going to miss out on what is so critical with this. So we're going to go, once we do Act 15, see what goes on, I'm going to go back to show you why it's so critical what's happening to Acts 15 and how bizarre it sounds. Okay? And how it actually fits into failed prophecy, where it failed, your character, messianic character failed to come, and you have to redefine what happens later on, having not had any instruction from your Messiah at all. Okay. So anyways, Paul had gone out and gotten some non-Jews after we said in verse 13, in chapter 13, that he was going to non-Jews, and he was somewhat successful. Okay? So he comes back to Jerusalem there, and he's talking with them. But some believers, let's go with 5, but some believers who belong to the sect of the Pharisees. One second. I thought they were Christians. How can there be Pharisees that belong to the Christians? Well, there's two things we learn from this. Number one, Pharisees means Jews. Jews who keep the Torah, period. The New Testament is confirming what we already know from Josephus. Pharisee means Orthodox Jew, which means basically Jew. Until actually the Enlightenment in Europe, there was no such a concept of being, other than what we would call Orthodox. Okay? In Germany, they started something called Reform, and that started, all the problems that exist as far as that's concerned. But if a person was Jewish, he would be Torah observant, and when he would observe the Torah, he would follow, basically, then it would be Pharisaic law, but it would follow the law of the rabbis of the time. That would be Judaism. And if he didn't want to do it, if he was, somebody would be a sinner, so he wouldn't do it. But that was what Judaism is. That was the case among Sephardim until today, basically. In Germany, due to the Enlightenment, that changed, and that causes something different. We can talk about that later on. It's more about Jewish history than otherwise. But basically, Judaism, and at that time that was the case, the law was Pharisaic law. And we talk about rabbinic Judaism, we're going to talk about it again. So again, it is necessary for them to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses. Okay, so the question is, what do we do with these non-Jews? What do we do with these Gentiles? What are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to become Jews? What are they supposed to do? The apostles and the elders met together to consider the matter. After there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, "My brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you, that I should be the one through whom the Gentiles will hear the message of the good news and become believers." Okay? And God, who knows the human heart, testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us, and in cleansing the hearts by faith, he has made no distinction between them and us. Now therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing the neck of the disciples' yoke? Neither our ancestors nor we have been able to bear. That's very interesting, because everybody until now was Pharisees. They were keeping the law. So saying, we can't do it? Throughout here, we've been hearing that there were people. Put that aside. What we do see here is it's up for a vote. What do we do with non-Jews? Okay? So the decision is made that basically they're going to follow what Paul said, with a few small things. They should keep away from idols and fornication, sexual immorality, eating what is strangled, and from blood. Blood is, of course, it says in Torah, strangled. Not quite sure whether this actually means that they have to eat kosher meat. It's very, and remember, people point out it's very similar to the 7 laws of Noah, by the way. Okay? But, okay, so now we see here in Acts 15 what's going on. Now, to me, this raises a number of very serious questions as a Jewish person who, as I said here, these are people, most people were observant Jewish Pharisees. They lived the Jewish life. Paul claims to have been a Pharisee, lived the Jewish life. So the question to me is very simply this. Jesus says goes only to the Jews. These people change and say, let's go to somebody else. Where does that come from? Is it something that they invented or they didn't invent? Now, one of the interesting things here in Acts 15 is what you don't see. Peter never says, Jesus told me, go to the non-Jews and they don't have to be circumcised.
Right.
Now, what makes that important? If you're Jewish and you're Orthodox like I am, that would be that should mean something to you. Now, very interesting. There's an interesting thing that I've been reading. It has more to do with my what I'm going to be doing, the historical Jesus. But Justin Martyr, his book called Dialogue with Trypho. Dialogue with Trypho is a supposed, it may in fact be the first book written to try and convince Jews to convert to Christianity. It's basically a dialogue, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that the dialogue actually was not a dialogue, more like the kind of dialogues that Plato has with Socrates. He sort of makes up both sides, but it's trying to conform to what he thinks each side would say. But importantly here, there's a very important point that we should be clear of. As a Jewish person, he has Trypho say this, his biggest complaint about Christians. But this is what we are most at a loss about, that you, professing to be pious and supposing yourself better than others, are not in any particular separated from them, and do not alter your mode of living from the nations, in that you observe no festivals or Sabbaths, and do not have the right of circumcision. Further, resting your hopes on a man that was crucified, you yet expect to obtain some good thing from God, while you do not obey his commandments. What's important to hear is, this is what not only a Jew in that time would believe, but a Jew even today believes. The Jews at all times would believe. How could you say you're doing God's will when it has no perspective with the commandments? You don't change your actions. You're doing the same as before. Have you not read that the soul that shall be cut off from his people who shall not have been circumcised on the 8th day? It said to Abraham. And this has been ordained for strangers and for slaves equally. The law says that if you have a slave, you have to circumcise him. But you, despising this covenant, rashly rejected whatever. Okay. The point being here that we see from Justin, quite frankly, the mindset of a Jewish person, what Peter would have thought and James would have thought, and if Paul is not lying about his beliefs, what Paul would have thought, that if somebody was to come and believe in the Jewish Messiah, in the fulfillment of that, who was non-Jewish, then there's some necessity to keep God's commandments. Somebody would have to tell them differently. Now, again, I want to add another point to here, because this shows me an indication that, in fact, some things in the New Testament were actually rewritten in order to make it sync up with things that we see later. Again, let's go through the history we have. Matthew 10:15, non-Jews only. Acts 1, after Jesus dies, Jews only. Okay? Up until Peter in 10, which he says 5-10 years later, Jews only. Peter 10, first instance. Okay? Paul, Acts 13, first instance of going to non-Jews. Okay? Now, those of you Christians who know the Bible very well should say, one second, what about the Great Commission? Matthew 28:16 through 20. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of it. One second. Jesus, at the end of Matthew, in Galilee still, tells them, go to the non-Jews. So how come it takes until Acts 10 for Peter to get the message? Wasn't Peter here among the disciples? He's one of the 11 disciples. Didn't Peter hear from Jesus? We're supposed to. So how come in Acts 10 he doesn't say, why is he so wondering? Of course, Jesus told me. Why at Acts 15, when they're talking, Peter didn't say, well, remember the Great Commission. Jesus told us we're supposed to go to the non-Jews. What's the big deal? Now, maybe you might think, well, of course they know it's supposed to be non-Jews. But in the beginning of Acts, let's look at Acts 1:6. So when they had come together, they asked him, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom of Israel? He replied, it is not for you to know the time, but you will see brother. Okay, fine. I'm sorry, a little bit earlier it talks about how Jesus was there for 40 days talking to them. Excuse me, in verse 3 it says, and he appeared to them during 40 days speaking about the kingdom of God. So he's talking to them about the kingdom of God. Now, after reading what it says in Justin Martyr, Jesus comes up to you. I want you, those of you who are not Jewish, who don't understand this, just think a second. You're a Jewish person, okay? Just like Justin Martyr says a trifo. And Justin Martyr is in the second century, okay? No difference in the first century. Okay? You believe that a non-Jew, in order to be right with God, no matter what, should change the way they live, make a difference in the way their life is. Okay? So Jesus is teaching you 40 days. And supposedly there's already been the Great Commission. What's the first question you're going to ask Jesus? The question that's going to come up in Acts 15. What do we do with them? Do they circumcise or not? That question should have come up in Acts 1. Why does Peter have to later? Why? Because the truth of the matter is the Great Commission obviously never happened. Great Commission was added there later on in order to reinterpret later what we find later they actually did in Acts. That's what we talk when we talk about the failed prophecy syndrome, where afterwards you reinterpret what happened. That's what happened. We see clearly going to the Jewish people only. Acts goes to the Jewish people only. It's talking about historically what happened. As Jewish people, we see eventually they decide to take non-Jews in. So they evolved into taking non-Jews in. Never anything about Jesus saying to. So when did the Great Commission actually occur? Acts 1 says they even talked to Jesus for 40 days after the crucifixion. If the Great Commission occurred, why isn't he telling them what to do? Why is it taken to Acts 15 for a vote of the council, a discussion of the council? Nobody says Jesus told us to do this. Why wouldn't anyone? Any Jewish person, you ask any religious Jewish person, if they said you're supposed to, what are you supposed to do? Well, we know this, the seven mitzvahs, but they know the seven laws they teach the children of Noah. We know about that. Every Jew, I learn about it because I deal with non-Jews a lot of time. So what that means is because Matthew, the Great Commission, the end of Matthew, never occurred. It was written into the earliest documents later to retroactively put in something that didn't really occur until 10, 15 years after Jesus died. That is what we mean when we talk about the failed prophecy syndrome, where you reinterpret something and then eventually you're going to write it back into earlier parts. Okay? That's the point. Now, this is very important. I don't want, this is something we're going to come up a lot of times when we talk about the New Testament. We're going to talk about the historicity. We're going to talk about the resurrection. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of things. We're going to see how this happens. When we look at certain events, when we see how there's a natural evolution of how things are looked at. So, for example, who is guilty in the killing of Jesus, in his crucifixion? Okay, first it comes a small group of Jews, becomes more and more and more. By the 2nd century, you'll find the Epistle of Barnabas talks about how the Jewish people and Pilate becomes eventually sainted by, I think the Coptic Church sainted Pilate. Okay, when you see these things coming on, you have to always think in the back of your mind, oh, failed prophecy syndrome. Does that tell what was originally there? Let's move our way back and see what it is. Okay? So that's very important. So again, what does this mean? What does this particular thing mean? Number one, the followers of Jesus changed the original message. The original message was a message for the Jewish people, as it has basically always been, as the prophets have always talked to the Jewish people. The Messiah is something that's supposed to come primarily to be a king and leader of the Jewish people. That's what people believed before Jesus died. And we are going to later on go with all the messianic prophecies. I'm building up to that, but I do want to get certain things out of the way before I do that. We'll see that that's exactly what the message always has been. And that non-Jews, secondarily, as we see with the instance in Matthew 15, we said that the non-Jewish world has a great benefit that comes from it once the Messianic kingdom is renewed and the knowledge of God goes out to the whole world, and the whole world will live in peace because of that. Okay, so that is something that happens. So we see that the message changed. And this is going to have a lot of implications on how we analyze New Testament texts. When we see differences, remember when you were taught, and all apologists say, the four Gospels, they look at things different ways. Each one sees things different ways. Well, that's on the assumption that we're talking about a true teaching that goes back to Jesus. But if we're really talking about true teachings that were reinterpreted after Jesus died by that circle in Jerusalem, and it gets spread out to different people, then we see how this being spread out to different people might have come back here, but changed when other people looked at it. So John gets this distorted message from after Jesus died and takes it his way. We'll talk about that in a lot of different later on. So again, the validity of the New Testament text now comes into question. Is that really what Jesus taught? Does it fit? Okay? We'll see this when we discuss, I'm going to go into the resurrection, and I'm going to talk in the birth, so that we find, for example, when Luke says misinformation, historical information about when Jesus was born, that's not because of anything other than it was written into the text later on, so that there's birth stories about the hero, just like there's birth stories a lot of other people have. It's very important to have birth stories. Okay? So again, another point that comes from this is New Testament theology. We're going to see that Jesus' theology in the New Testament when he lived was repentance, follow God's commandments and stuff like that. Changes in the New Testament. Okay? Later on. All of these are examples of what we're talking about, failed prophecy syndrome. We're going to talk about a little about historicity, when we talk about the New Testament. You need to keep this in mind when we're talking about this. Is not an ad hoc thing. This has been shown psychologically. There have been studies on it consistently. It is a real known thing that is actually predictable. Okay? So when we analyze it, you have to keep this in mind. Okay, that's what I want to do today. Next week, we're going to go back and start looking about even taking into mind that these oral things were being changed at the time. The question is, how did they look at these as time went on? And so we're going to look at end of the second century, how these were looked upon, and we're going to eventually get up to what actually is the canon. But the main point we have to realize now is that even were we to get back to the original texts, as they were the original Matthew, the original John, that does not tell us what Jesus actually taught. We have to really weed through some things and see if we can figure what that is. Okay, I think that'll be enough for today.
Okay, very good.
William, if you see any questions there is about almost 10 minutes, I think.
Right.
So,
very good.
First, see if there's any questions. If not, if somebody wants to ask a question, call in and ask a question. I'll answer a question also if I can.
Okay, let me go ahead and log into the Ring Central then, and we'll see if we can open up the phone lines here. Questions get posed all the time, but most of the time it's not really related to this show. So a lot of those we kind of skip over. But
yeah, I understand that. I prefer actually if somebody calls in questions related to the show, because many of the questions they're going to ask, I will eventually get to them, and I'm going to get to them in excruciating detail, as I've tried to do here now, so that you can understand clearly exactly why I'm giving the answers that I'm giving.
Right on. Very good. Okay, well, the phone lines are officially open, so if anybody wants to call in with your question related to the show, otherwise you're going to have to call in, ask your question, and we'll say on another show, and you can say hi, and he can say bye, and you can all hang up and wait for another caller. So, so if you want to have a discussion regarding tonight's show, definitely keep it topic-oriented. If you do not mind, that would be great. So
I would really strongly.
There we go.
I would strongly suggest that those of you who are listening to this listen over to this numerous times until you're really, really clear about it, because it will come in a lot in the future. When we talk about New Testament objections, you have to keep in mind what we're talking about here. Just like we see in Acts, from Matthew to Acts, how there was an evolution that the people on themselves did, not from Jesus, on themselves, and it's clear that they're retroactively putting certain things into the New Testament in order to make it agree with what they believe later.
Right.
You have to realize when we start talking about New Testament, we're going to be looking at it with that perspective. You have to understand that basic fundamental way of looking into it.
Counter Missionary asked on YouTube, could you ask Rabbi Moshe Shulman why the Great Commission is only mentioned in the book of Matthew and not in the other three Gospels?
That's interesting. A lot of things in Matthew are basically written to Jews or a more Jewish Christian audience. That's what a lot of scholars, both Christian and non-Christian, seem to indicate. I have no reason to believe that that's not the case. Although, again, there's certain issues, remember, it's been tampered with. So that's really the more appropriate place it is. That's where you find that Jesus says that you should go to the Jews only. So it's the obvious place where you're supposed to say to change that. That's got to be fixed. None of the other Gospels actually says that, as far as I know. I couldn't find it.
Right.
It says that you should go to the Jews only. So if Matthew says go to the Jews, then if you're going to be doctoring the text, or when you're writing down the text, originally writing down the text in the 50s, 60s, whatever was done, I think Matthew's like in the 70s, late 70s. When you're writing it down, that doesn't agree with the Christianity that's going on around you right now. Mm-hmm. So you have to add something there to make sure that it exists. So that's the place where we're probably going to. Again, that's a speculation on my part, and it may not in fact be true. I just want to clarify between what I'm speculating about and what we're dealing with, which is fact. It is a fact that the Great Commission is just not consistent with what we see between Matthew 10:15 and the book of Acts up until Acts 15. Okay, right. The Great Commission could never have happened if you consider those things. It has to be a false thing, something put into to make Matthew agree with what we see later in Acts.
Okay,
that is fact. That, as far as I'm concerned, is factual. Because there's no way you can imagine a Great Commission and Jesus talking to people for 40 days with a question of exactly, well, if you want us to go to non-Jews and baptize them, what do you want us to do with them? What are we supposed to do? Can they eat kosher? Can they eat not kosher? What are they allowed to do? I mean, we find this all the time today. Christians who leave, Christianity, they don't want to convert to Judaism. So, they ask me all the time, what am I supposed to do?
Right.
It is the obvious question.
I don't know if you could do this in a nutshell.
Just ask that.
I don't know if you could do this on one foot or not, but this is coming from me. I've heard different topics on it, but one thing I hear Messianics say all the time is you've got Moshiach. Actually, let's take this. Remind me of this question, though. Moshiach ben David, Moshiach ben Yosef, and are they contemporaries?
We're going to discuss that later. That's
okay, good.
It's a very long subject.
All right, very good. Caller, welcome to the show. Please tell us your name. Where are you calling from?
North Carolina.
Hello. Welcome from North Carolina. You have a question for the rabbi?
Hey, I had a question. Went to the tour store yesterday, and I want to ask about the scapegoat.
Okay.
Okay. So what about it?
And specifically about Azazel.
Mm-hmm. Azazel, right?
I didn't hear that word.
He's specifically referring to Azazel.
Nobody.
Azazel is referring to the desert where they sent the.
Rabbi, hang on one second. He's explaining his question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, the rabbi couldn't even explain what Azazel was.
Okay.
So the scapegoat, it went at there were 10 stages, and then the scapegoat was thrown off the cliff, and then so my question is what was when I have to ask if one of the goats was for God and one was to go out in the wilderness.
Right, one was to carry the sins out of the camp. Right.
But could come back.
Say the last sentence again. You said that could come back or could not?
It could not come back.
Right. Okay.
It was not supposed to come back.
Right.
Yeah,
what is your question
sent to the
specifically?
desert for a vacation, a permanent vacation.
Right. So what is your specific question?
Well, we actually started talking about in Christianity, the 10, they actually based that off the 10 processions for Jesus, his crucifixion. They took that part of the Jewish Bible and made that into Jesus' crucifixion.
Right. Yeah. It's mixed messages. I don't even think they even understand it because they're getting the roles reversed. It's one of those
bizarre things. We will discuss it. Actually, I'm going to give a full lecture on concept of sin and atonement. So obviously, I'm going to talk about it. But in short, there were actually two goats. They're supposed to be exactly identical. One's chosen out to be used, as a certain sacrifice, basically to purify the temple, as a purification.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is supposed to carry the sins out into the desert, and essentially what it is, it's being sent away. They didn't have Florida at the time, so they sent them into the desert basically to live there permanently. The rabbis actually instituted, later it was instituted, that they should actually kill it because one's not allowed to eat it. So if it went out in the desert and somebody ate it, since it was separated for God, it's not proper to eat it. Anything that's separated to God from among the sacrificial animals is not allowed to be eaten. Therefore, that animal being sent out, even if it was alive, the question would be if you could slaughter it and eat it later on, and they didn't want that to happen, so they would actually throw it down a mountain later on. That came later on.
Right.
But originally it was just sent out into the desert to just, if you've ever been to Jerusalem, you go out there, this is, outside Jerusalem, it's a desert. So it was sent out to the desert to pasture and to live there. That was basically it. It was a symbolic act. Symbolic, nobody put a sins actually physically on it. It's symbolic act saying that we're sending away our sins to the desert, and they should just disappear out there.
Right. And one final thing I guess you could say you could take with you too is the mixed messages that Christianity teaches on that. It shows that Jesus bore the sins of the world, right? But it couldn't have been if there was an Azazel, because the Azazel that was sent away was the one that bore the sins. So it's confusion.
William, actually, the point there is the one that died, that was sacrificed,
right,
did not bear the sins.
Right, that's what I was saying.
It's the one that was sent out to live in retirement in the desert.
Right. Exactly.
That's the one that bore the sins. So it's actually living is actually taking care of the sins. Dying doesn't take care of the sins. Dying is only purification purposes.
Very cool.
Most of the sacrifices for Yom Kippur itself were purification sacrifices for various things that could happen. These get very complicated. Most people don't understand the sacrificial system, so I want to leave that for that. But basically, most of the sacrifices on Yom Kippur were because of impurities that could be imparted into the temple accidentally.
Very good. Well, hey, thank you for your call. It was a great question.
Well, it was a discussion on Yom Kippur, and it got into something else.
Yeah, they tend to conflate Yom Kippur with Pesach because in the chronological order of the reading, they're very close together. It actually did that to me for many years. It took me a long time to get through that. So they're conflating two stories together. So we're going to let you go for now because we're actually at our marker, and I've got another show that's starting here in about 30 minutes. So thank you for your call. It was a great question. And thank you all for tuning in for sure. Rabbi, this has been a very, very, very good set for sure. So looking forward to what you're going to have out for next week.
Remember, I'm going to Israel. So
So next week we're off?
I'll be there 2 weeks. I'll be in Israel 2 weeks, and the time is not going to work out very well.
I got you. That's right. I remember you saying that now. Very good. Okay, well, very good. Well, I'll tell you what. It's I'm glad it worked out well tonight. So We even managed to start on time, which was kind of nice.
Yeah.
Of course, I know you're always ready. It's just this live broadcasting thing is always hard to start on time. So anyway, thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel and turn on notifications. And if you like what we're doing here, feel free to go to TanakTalk.com and show the love. You guys have a great week. Shalom, shalom, and Shavua Tov. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי